Again, at the beginning of this new year, and the East Coast is experiencing winter all in one weekend, huh? With the, what are they naming that snowstorm? Jonah? Jonah or Jonas?
No, it's 23 inches of global warming.
23 inches of global warming. Yeah, well, at least it'll give Washington and New York a chance to, reflect on that a little bit as they are holed up in this weekend, snowed in, huh? And watch what happens in 9 months from now. And speaking of that, last week, we were looking at all of a sudden the population explosion that happened in and around Jacob and his family, right? Yep. So he ends up with two wives, sister wives, Leah and Rachel. Both of them have handmaids who become like secondary wives. And all of a sudden, in very short order, it seems, all of a sudden all these women are having children left and right, and there's a whole bunch of something going on. Now, and it's presented in, really a concentrated, we got kind of a Reader's Digest version here, but it's over, like a 20-year period. Jacob, of course, is in the homeland of his uncle Laban. 2 wives, 2 secondary wives, 12 kids. But essentially, he's working as an indentured servant to Uncle Laban. He's got 20 years here paying his dues. 7 years for each of the 2 formal wives, bride price, so to speak, and then 6 more years. When is the guy going to, see the light? And we don't know exactly how old he was when he got there. Okay, so was he a young teenager off, or older teenagers off on sent by his mama? Let's not forget that, huh? Rebecca, his Jewish mama, sent by to Uncle Laban. And, to get away from the conflict that he had with his twin brother, Esau, who had plans to kill him. So, now, chapter 31 begins, chapter 31 in the book of Genesis begins the start of the plans of the flight from Laban and Jacob's return with his great entourage. Now, in this segment, which, folks, this will be like the last segment in the Jacob-Laban cycle. Okay? So, hopefully this morning we'll kind of finish up with Mr. Jacob. But his leave-taking is not going to be easy, and there's all kinds of trickery. Now, that's not a formal biblical term. There's a strong trickery motif present, not only amongst the men, but also with the women folk. Of course, we saw that last week. There was all kinds of manipulations going on with them as well, huh? So, let's start off. When Jacob started his journey, the kid really didn't know where to go. His mama just pointed him in the direction northeast and just keep going till you hit Uncle Laman's, land of Uncle Laman. Genesis 28:15, he was at a place called Bethel, and he had that dream. That's what you get when you sleep on a rock. Okay, but the place Bethel, which Beth is house or home, and El, of course, is a name for God, actually Canaanite God. So, home or house of God. And he has that dream of a stairway going up to heaven, and the promise of God, he felt, God saying to him, verse 13, and there was God standing beside him and saying, I, the Lord, am the God of your forefather Abraham, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you are lying I will give to you and your descendants. These shall be plentiful as the dust of the earth, and through them you shall spread out, east and west and north and south. In you and your descendants and all the nations of the earth will find blessing. And know that I am with you, and I will protect you wherever you go, and bring you back to this land. And I will never leave you until I have done what I have promised. So, he in turn, Jacob, verse 20, made a vow. If God remains with me to protect me on this journey I am making, and give me enough bread to eat and clothing to wear, I come back safe to my father's house, the Lord shall be my God. And this stone I have set up as a memorial stone shall be God's abode. And of everything you give me, I will faithfully return 1/10 to you. Now, that response, that vow taking, certainly is an indication that that portion of that episode comes from a later source. And particularly the thing about 1/10 giving back, that sounds very much like a priestly source. It sounds like something that's out of the Mosaic law, right? Of tithe. So, now, while Jacob, now we fast forward back to 31, after we've renewed what was going on, and we have an indication here, well, actually chapter 30, let's go to chapter 30. Rachel finally has a child after that whole business about the mandrakes and so on. Remember, we talked about that last week. Yeah. Ground cherries. It says, I'm looking at around 25. After Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, Give me leave to go to my homeland. Let me have my wives, for whom I served you, and my children too, that I may depart. You know very well the service that I have rendered you. Okay, so he sets it up. He wants to return home now. Okay, he has all these wives and children. I have learned through divination that it is because of you that God has blessed me. This is Laban talking, verse 26. So, he continued, state what wages you want from me, and I will pay you. remember, I said last week, there's a strong motif in this section of payment and wages. Payment and wages. What should I pay you? Verse 31, Laban asked. Jacob answered, you do not have to pay me anything outright. I will again pasture and tend your flock if you do this one thing for me. Go through the whole flock today, remove from it every dark animal among the sheep, every spotted or speckled one among the goats. Only such animals will be my wages. In the future, whenever you check on these wages of mine, let my honesty testify against me. Any animal in my possession that is not a speckled or spotted goat or a dark sheep got there by theft. Very well, said Laban. Let it be as you say. So he sets this up, and it sounds initially like it's kind of a dumb deal, on his part. The valuable sheep are the white sheep. And, well, I don't know too much about goats, all right? But it's like he just wants the dark goats. Do they give better yogurt? I don't know. Huh? Yeah, it's like dark cows give chocolate milk, right? Yeah. So, but that's the deal. So Laban says, okay, only such aid, all right. So that same day, Laban removed the streaked and spotted he-goats and the speckled spotted she-goats and all those with some white on them, as well as the fully dark-colored sheep. This he left in charge of his sons. And then he went out on a 3-day journey between himself and Jacob. Now, the next section is kind of weird. Okay? He does selective breeding. 10 years ago, when we went through this, we had a veterinarian doc here. You remember Dr. Mead was here?
Yes.
Huh? And maybe some of you remember, he got up in one of our classes and he did a whole genetic kind of tree for us to show us how genetically that, what is being talked about here, and how, Jacob did end up with white sheep. Of course, this is all, as these ancients presented it, it's all directed by God. And there's a lot of stuff of what he did. Basically, he does selective breeding. Now, there's kind of a folklore connected with the selective breeding. You might have footnotes. I know there's a footnote in the New American Bible. I think there's a footnote in the New Jerusalem Bible that was more informative on this. But the bottom line, folks, is that those who don't have the New American Bible, it says, Jacob's stratagem was based on a widespread notion among simple people that visual stimuli can have prenatal effects on the offspring of breeding animals. Thus, the rods on which Jacob had whittled stripes or bands or chevron marks were thought to cause the female goats that looked at them to bear kids that were lighter colored marks on their dark skin, while the gray hues were thought to bear lambs with dark marks on them simply by visual crossbreeding with the dark goats. I didn't know that goats and sheep were colorblind, or okay.
I have a real problem with this
describe the territory that they're in. If they're in grazing territory for sheep and goats, they would be nibbling every shoot and everything there. So how in the world did he find enough shoots to whittle to take care of all those she and he goats around the watering area?
Well, the thing is, first of all, it's in the territory of what we call today northeastern Iraq or northwestern Iraq, northeastern Syria, probably more northeastern Syria. Okay. Secondly, there's a lot of flat area, and there's some mountains, ridden by mountains there. A lot of those villages that have been taken over by Daesh are basically they're like this. They're pastoral people, little small villages, tending their flocks yet and just raising their families. The fact that it says that Uncle Laban took his nice pristine and went 3 days' journey would indicate that that would have been, removing the herds to pasture lands that could accommodate them. Okay, but it seems as if Jacob is left in those pasture lands that are heading back towards his homeland. All right. So we go on to the next thing. God bless you. Beginning of chapter 31. So Jacob learned that Laban's sons were saying, Jacob has taken everything that belonged to our father, and he has accumulated all his wealth of his by using our father's property. Jacob perceived too that Laban's attitude toward him is not what it previously was. So the Lord said to Jacob, return to your land of your fathers where you were born. I'll be with you. Now, Jacob does a curious thing. Not a curious thing. It's going to be a good thing for him. But something that usually people in these patriarchal communities would not do. He consults his wives. What? Yeah. What? So verse 4, so Jacob sent for Rachel and Leah. Remember, those two gals weren't getting along too much. There's jealousy and so on. To meet him where he was in the field with his flock. So he has the women come out to where he's tending his flock so that he's away from other ears. And there he said, I've noticed that your father's attitude has changed, but the God of my father has been with me. And yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages time after time. Check your translation, verse 7. Some of you have 10 times over.
Yes.
Who has that? New Jerusalem Bible, yes. He has changed my wages 10 times over. God, however, did not let him do me any harm. Whatever your father said, and then it goes into his explanation of his breeding practices and so on. Verse 11, in a dream, God's messenger told me, Jacob, here, I said. He said, note well, all the she-goats and he-goats and that. I am the God who appeared, verse 13, to you in Bethel, where you anointed a memorial stone and made a vow to me. Up then, leave this land, return to the land of your birth. Now, what are these two daughters of Laban going to say in response?
When we get out of it.
Well, there's a lot of trickery, okay? So, Rachel and Leah answered him, have we still an heir's portion to our father's house? So their first concern, will we still get something from our father? Okay? Are we not regarded by him as outsiders? are we not, he not only sold us, he has even used up the money that he got for us. All the wealth that God reclaimed from our Father really belongs to us and our children. Therefore, do just as God has told you.
Good idea.
Here's a guy with 2 wives. A guy with 2 wives. And he's got all these kids. And you know, what is it? About 8 out of the 12, 7 or 8 out of the 12, over half the kids come from these 2 women. And they are in agreement with him. I mean, you know, most guys with 1 wife have a hard time finding an agreement with her, right? Huh? That's what I'm told, anyhow. Yeah.
According to what it says here, he did bring a little money for dowry.
You know, that's what it seems. It didn't say that in the beginning. Yeah. So, what do you have? You have 2 different source traditions getting overlaid here. Okay. The J source and the E source, basically. All right. So that's what you got going here. But it does say that and maybe the payment that she's talking about is the payment that they recognize, the payment in years that he has given to his father. But they are in agreement. Let's do what you want. And so the next thing says, verse 17, he proceeded to put his children and his wives on camels, and they drove off with all their livestock and property that he had acquired at Padam Aram to go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan. So there's a little problem, people who study this, little problem they would have about him using camels. They feel that domesticated camels didn't enter at this time period yet, and certainly not with Israelite people or these patriarchal people. There's a little problem with that. But as they are going and leaving, and getting ready to leave. Now, verse 19. Now Laban had gone away to shear his sheep, and Rachel had meanwhile appropriated her father's household idols. Jacob had hoodwinked Laban the Aramean by not telling him of his intended flight. Thus he made his escape with all that he had, and once he had crossed the Euphrates, he headed for the highlands of Gilead. Now, they give us some markers here. The Euphrates River, of course. He's in the area of Padam Aram. Padam Aram, basically northern Syria today. Okay. The Euphrates River does come up this way. We've heard in the news recently about a battle at a place called Aleppo. So that is very near to where this territory is. And so now it indicates that he leaves and crosses the Euphrates River and goes to the area of Gilead. And that would be right about here. Also as part of present-day Syria. The curious thing is, the Lord God so far has protected Laban, or Jacob, from this double dealing. And in Hebrew, where it goes through and gives the kind of the details of this selective breeding, in Hebrew there's a play on words between the reeds, the popular reeds, and the white stripes and the white core that the sheep are looking at. And there's a play on words actually with Laban. In the Hebrew language, Laban means white.
White?
White. Yeah. So there's a play on words with that. And one scholarly interpretation is this: in a sense, Jacob is using the knowledge of Laban's wife, Laban's nature, against him. So Jacob is the one who in his youth deceived his father and his brother. Remember that?
Yes.
To get the blessing and the birthright and so on. Now he becomes the deceiver once again by doing this selective breeding. This small reference about Rachel stealing her household gods, the word for those household gods is teraphim. They're small figurines or totems, like minor deities or spirits, unique to each family. And in many ancient cultures at that time, this existed along with their major gods and their celebration of their major gods. Later on in Mosaic law, the use of such totems and figurines were going to be condemned. So basically, what she got are these little figures of basically household gods that were very dear to her father, and to a certain extent represented to the whole household of Laban the sources of that family's power or energy, and concerning mysterious things. Okay, basically a part of their religion. In other words, Rachel stole her daddy's Lucky Charms. Okay?
When it says,
But why? We'll find out later. So after 7 years and 7 days, Jacob and his family, they're moving away across the Euphrates into the highlands of Gilead. Laban the Aramean comes back from shearing his sheep, 3 days' journey, finds this out, and begins to pursue Jacob and his whole household and so on. And this is going to set up a dramatic confrontation. Roy,
Well, my point was, as you're talking about this, the fact that they took the household idols, and yet we are talking about a people who are now believing in one God. How very tenuous that whole relationship with God and the past is. They're like on a peak on either side. Pretty interesting as you look at these people and where they really are.
Well, the thing is, they're not really believing yet. Even Jacob isn't totally, he will, in the next segment, when he and Laban finally have their confrontation, and it's been building up and building up. It's very dramatic, the next section, okay? When Uncle Laban finally, Uncle Laban is hell-bent on, probably killing off this guy. But we do get an interesting thing. Verse 22. On the third day, word came to Laban that Jacob had fled, taking his kinsmen with him. He pursued him for 7 days until he caught him in the hill country of Gilead. But that night, God appeared to Laban, the Aramean, in a dream and warned him, "Take care not to threaten Jacob with any harm." Now that's a curious thing. Okay? Huh? You have something else?
well, I just wondered, so where you said Laban is a white? Laban means white?
White.
Oh, white, I don't understand this.
Okay. Well, we moved away from that. That was connected with the selective breeding practice. Okay, the wordplay with the selective breeding. No, white. I'm sorry. people over here from Darboy, they understood. That's my accent, I'm sorry. White, Laban meant. So, when Laban overtook Jacob, then where Jacob's tents were pitched in the highlands, Laban also pitched his tents there in Mount Gilead. And then, what do you mean, Laban demanded of Jacob, by hoodwinking mean? Do you have that in the...
Yes.
What do you have in the New Jerusalem Bible?
Outwitting.
What? Outwitting? Outwitting. Deceiving. There's a footnote here. They have hoodwink here in the New American Bible. And literally it means stolen the heart. Literally, stolen the heart. Now, which is going to bear up. So, is Laban talking about his children and his grandchildren? The 2 daughters that he married off? And the grandchildren? Or is he talking about something else? What would be something else that he would be talking about?
The sheep.
The sheep, the flocks, well, the deal was made ahead of time, and he agreed to the deal with the flocks.
Could have been his little figurines.
Yeah, it could be his little figurines. His household gods. You know, yeah, you literally stole my heart. As it goes on. Why did you dupe me, verse 27, by stealing away secretly? You should have told me, and I would have sent you off with merry singing, the sound of tambourines and harp. You did not even allow me a parting kiss to my daughters and my grandchildren. What you have now done is a senseless thing. I have it in my power to harm all of you. But last night the God of your father said, take care not to threaten Jacob with any harm. Now, he's bluffing. This is buffoonery. It's bluffing. Okay? It's trickery. It's trickery. Don't believe Uncle Laban. Okay? Don't believe anything he says. Oh yeah. So, and as it goes on, so the next thing he says, granted that you had to leave because you were desperately homesick for your father's house. But why did you steal my gods? Now the truth of his heart is coming out. Why did you steal my gods? Jacob said, I was frightened at the thought that you might take your daughters away from me by force. But as for your gods, if the one you find with them shall not remain alive.
Ooh.
Who stole them?
Rachel.
What is Rachel to Jacob?
His favorite.
His favorite. But he doesn't know. Jacob doesn't know that the girl stole them. Now, what happens next is almost comical. It's almost comical. Verse 33. Laban then went in and searched Jacob's tent and Leah's tent, as well as the tents of the maidservants. But he didn't find the idols. Leaving Leah's tent, he went into Rachel's tent. Okay. So here's Uncle Laban. Okay. This great patriarch with all, this household and all these flocks and everything. He's going through all these tents, all this woman stuff and all these tents, messing everything up, throwing everything out, looking over everything. And he's looking, what's he looking for? His little bitty idols. His Lucky Charms. Okay? So, now, we know it was Rachel. And so the next thing is, Now Rachel had taken them, verse 34, put them inside a camel cushion and seated herself upon them. When Laban rummaged through the rest of her tent without finding them, Rachel said to her father, let my lord feel offended that I cannot rise in your presence. A woman's period is upon me. So despite his search, he didn't find his idols. Now, not only is this kind of comical, this old guy going through all woman stuff in the tent and so on, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But here's Rachel again, wily. You know how wily she was, right? We saw that before, huh? Right? And she's saying, don't come here, I have my... Now, the irony, of course, is that Laban is actually, violating a custom, a code. Some of you may have read that popular book, The Red Tent, some years ago. Okay, how many read that, The Red Tent? Okay, there's a few. Okay, even men that read it. Okay, and one of the things about that book, it takes something that is only hinted at, like in a passage like this in the Bible, and that is the customary code. Women, when they came to their time of the month and so on, or when they were about to give birth, they went off into a special place, a special tent. It would be defilement for men to come into contact at that time. Later on in Mosaic law, there would be specific laws from Moses concerning this sort of thing. All right, but at this point, it's just customary. But here's the ironic thing. Okay, if she's sitting on the cushions or sitting on these idols, and if indeed she is, that time of the month, she's defiling them anyhow. And he, being in her presence, in her tent at that time, Uncle Laban, is getting defiled himself. So, unless she's lying. And she was, because later on in the journey she gives birth. So maybe she was pregnant, yeah. Anyhow, she accomplishes her purpose. And she proves to Jacob to be, really a worthy wife. She saves the day by her trickery. She saves the day by her thievery. All right? Now, after this, verse 36, now Jacob now enraged, begins to upbraid Laban. What crime or offense have I committed? He demanded. Now that you should hound me so fiercely, now that you have ransacked all my things, have you found a single object taken from your belongings? If so, produce it here, before your kinsmen and mine, and let them decide between us. So, so far in the story, in the cycle, in the saga of Jacob and Uncle Laban, Jacob has appeared, always to be, Uncle Laban is the Lord, right? And Laban has always been and Jacob has always been the one to, get tricked. He's always been the one that, Jacob always got the short end of the stick, right? Laban always ended up on top, right? But here finally he speaks up.
He's not indentured anymore.
Well, yeah, he's moving away from his indentured servitude, huh? Okay. So, The next section it's kind of interesting, from 38 down to, beyond 40, well, to 42. He goes through all that he's done for Laban. He just, summarizes all the things about how he handled the flock and how, verse 41, for 20 years that I have now spent in your household, I have slaved 14 years for your 2 daughters, 6 years for your flock, while you changed my wages time after time, and some of you might have 10 times over. Now, here's a telling thing. If my ancestral God, the God of Abraham and the awesome one of Isaac, had not been on my side, you would now have sent me away empty-handed. But God saw to my plight. This is a real key to understanding what's going on here. So as he or the writer is setting this up, it's God, the God of versus the gods, the idols. And here, I don't know if it's the very first description, but it's one of the first descriptions of God, the one and only God, the Lord High God of Abraham and Isaac. And what is being professed, you might say here, is Jacob understanding his movements, his decisions, his being protected now by that God. And it took that event of Rachel's trickery for him to become aware of that. The way it has been presented here, probably by the Elwood source. And so this is a very dramatic conflict. But this little phrase that he uses, we need to point out, it's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and now there's the beginning of the acceptance of Jacob of the God of his father and grandfather. And that God, not formed by totems or little idols or like Lucky Charms.
That goes back to what I was saying before, or questioning.
How so?
Well, the fact that we now realize that the idols were one side of the belief, and Jacob realizes who the real God is.
Yes, and this is a kind of a denouement,
Yeah.
so to speak, in this whole thing. Because it's all written from the standpoint of people who believe in only one God. It's all written and sourced out, right? The source comes from those who believe in the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. So this phrase becomes a very dramatic one.
But it's true in everyone's life that all of a sudden the light goes on.
Okay.
No matter if you're 7 or 10 or 30, like Jacob.
So Pat is saying, it goes on in many people's lives. I don't know if it's everyone, but there's a point in time when there's a, religious experience, a religious conversion. The light goes on. Okay.
And when he knew that one same God had spoken to him, and also to Laban.
Well, that whole business about that the God spoke to Laban, that's
And Laban told him.
I kind of take that with a grain of salt, but okay.
That wasn't the little figurines that spoke to him.
Well, it wasn't figurines. He didn't have them because he was after those little figurines. Okay. Now, so what happens now is Laban proposes something. Verse 43. He tries to put up a strong front, Uncle Laban. The women are mine, the children are mine, the flocks are mine. Everything you see belongs to me. But since these women are my daughters, I will now do something for them and for their children that they have borne. Come then, we will make a pact with you and I. The Lord will be the witness between us. So that first part, he's extending, property rights. And the custom at that day and age, the women, the children, besides the flocks and everything else, were the property rights of the chieftain, the head of the clan. Okay? So now, after that, there's kind of a bizarre back and forth kind of thing. The key thing is that what comes out of it is, in some translations they have a pact. It's called a treaty. Some translations may call it a covenant, but that wouldn't be quite right. And basically there's, on one side, it's don't come after me and don't harm us. On the other side, Laban is setting up the boundaries. This will be the boundaries between us. And there's that's indicated by the etymology of the names that are given to those places. Boundary stones are set up on one side, memorial mounds on another. Each has its own name. Laban tacitly recognizes Jacob's God. And we find that verse 53. May the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, their ancestral deities, maintain justice between us. So Jacob took the oath by the awesome one of Isaac. So he swore by his father's God to uphold this. The God of Nahor. Now, Nahor was said to, earlier in the genealogy, it was said to be like a brother to Abraham that was left behind. The patriarch or the founder or the ancestor of Arameans, of which Laban is identified. But in another passage, even Father Abraham is identified as an Aramean. That's from a certain clan group, Aramean. Not Arab, not Chaldean, Aramean. Okay, not Hittite, not Hivite, not Egyptian, Aramean. So, the deal is sealed with a meal. In both things. The deal is sealed with a meal. Okay? What happened when Jacob first came and Laban first recognized Jacob as a distant relative? They had a meal, right? What happened after Jacob he thought it was Rachel, but it was, they had a meal, right? Wedding banquet. And here we have indication of a third ceremonial, communal meal, but here it's sealing the deal, sealing the pact, sealing the treaty. Chapter 32, the beginning of chapter 32 then. After passing the night, early the next morning, Laban kissed his grandchildren and his daughters goodbye. And then he set out on his journey back home, while Jacob continued on his way. Hey, let me point something out to you. Do you remember when Jacob first came to this land? That whole business at the well and rolling the stone off the well and he showed great strength and so on, and Rachel was there and he went up and kissed her, and then Rachel ran home, and Uncle Laban came And how did Uncle Laban greet him? He too kissed him. Okay, right? Welcoming Jacob. 20 years later, Uncle Laban kisses the grandkids. He kisses the daughters. And he turns his back on Jacob. He doesn't give him what should have been the family kiss. So one was very welcoming and customary, as a chieftain would do with a long-lost relative, welcoming him into his home, serving him a meal, and so on. And here, upon their departure, there was no such leave-taking. Okay, who got the better deal?
Jacob started off with nothing, he ended up with 2 wives and a girlfriend, dogs and cows and pigs and gold.
Okay.
Pretty good for a poor guy with nothing who started out.
That's right.
Okay, Richard is saying, starting out with a poor guy that comes, yeah, well, a good point. He comes into it with seemingly, no gift to give, no dowry. It's just like, here I am, I'm your relative, Uncle Laban, I'm looking for, right? And now he's leaving with all this property and these wives and all these kids and male and female servants and so on. But,
That's not so bad, 20 years and made a fortune.
20 years he made a fortune. What else? Remember, going through this, ordinarily, a Bible teacher would not have gone through and spent so much time with the women. What did we learn about Jacob and the women? Jacob is a patriarch. What did we learn about the matriarchs?
The roles that they played in history.
Yep.
They played an underlying role that made it all happen.
Which is true for all history.
Pat says, well, that's true in all history.
Not true. In this case, it's a historical perspective of finding a true God.
In this case, there is and has been really a significant role, and not just as in their childbearing. Okay? It's a role that's played collaboratively with their husband. It's significant that this pointed out that it was Leah and Rachel who agreed with Jacob. Let's pack up the kids and everything and get the heck out of here. Okay? That they are in agreement and they are in support. And then the wily gifts of Rachel. Laban talked about being hoodwinked.
So was Jacob.
And remember what hoodwinked meant? You've stolen my heart. And it was even his own daughter who, did that and covered it up and defiled it. Okay? So away they went. So I think this whole study with Jacob particularly. Now, we're not going to go into detail what happens after this. He's going to have an encounter with his brother Esau, and he's going to fight with the Lord's messenger, and he's going to throw his back and his hip out of whack, and he's going to be crippled, and we're going to change his name, and there's no women involved. But there is one more story once they get to the land of Canaan, and that I want to look at. So thank you very much for coming, everyone.
This shows what most women know, that the man is the head of the house, like the woman is the neck.